This is the only weapon in human history that killed twice as many people during its production as it did in combat. 20,000 concentration camp prisoners died in the underground tunnels, assembling flying bombs that would claim the lives of 10,000 people on the other end of Europe. But the victims would hear their death approaching. For the first time in the history of war, the sound of a weapon would become as destructive as its explosive. The characteristic buzz of the pulse jet engine could be heard from 16 kilometers away, and when it suddenly cut out, the people below had exactly 12 seconds. 12 seconds to find cover or to pray. In the spring of 1943, the Third Reich was slowly but inexorably beginning to lose the war. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht was retreating east. The skies over Germany were dominated by armadas of American and British bombers, sometimes over 1,000 aircraft in a single raid. The Luftwaffe was bleeding dry, losing experienced pilots faster than it could train new ones. Synthetic fuel plants burned under Allied bombs. On the night of March 25, 1943, British bombers turned the medieval city of Lübeck into a blazing inferno. Hitler flew into a rage. He demanded vengeance, immediate and crushing. But how to respond? Sending 100 bombers to London meant losing 100 bombers. British radar and night fighters had turned the sky over England into a death trap. The Führer needed a wonder weapon, something that would reach London without a pilot, without an expensive airplane, without the high-octane gasoline that was catastrophically scarce. Something so cheap it could be churned out in the thousands. Something so simple that its production wouldn't require skilled workers. They had all been sent to the front. It was at this moment that a strange project by an engineer named Robert Lusser from the small firm Fieseler landed on the desks of Luftwaffe leadership. The project for an unmanned flying bomb with a revolutionary engine that looked like a drain pipe and roared like a motorcycle from hell. The history of the pulse jet engine began long before the war. Back in 1928, Munich inventor Paul Schmidt, obsessed with the idea of creating the world's simplest jet engine, began experiments with a strange design, a steel tube with valves that was supposed to create thrust through a series of fuel mixture explosions. Schmidt received a patent in 1931, but his prototype stubbornly refused to work for more than a few minutes. The valves burned out, the tubes cracked from vibration, and the generated thrust could barely lift a model airplane. By 1939, the Argus company picked up Schmidt's ideas and tried to create an unmanned target drone for training anti-aircraft gunners. The result was comical. The device flew anywhere but where the designers intended. Its flight range was a pitiful 50 kilometers, and its accuracy was measured not in meters, but in kilometers of deviation from the target. The most absurd attempt was to create a manned version for testing. The first test pilot died when the engine's vibration literally shook him out of the cockpit. The second crashed after losing control due to violent shaking. The third managed to parachute out before his machine disintegrated in midair. The project was about to be canceled, but then the only female test pilot of the Third Reich, Hannah Reich, intervened. The petite blonde, weighing 40 kilograms, accomplished the impossible. She realized the problem was the shift in the center of gravity as fuel was consumed. All that was needed was to constantly adjust the trim tabs, compensating for the weight shift. Reich successfully landed the cursed machine, proving the fundamental viability of the concept. The genius of the final V-1 design lay in its astounding primitiveness. The fuselage, a welded pipe made of sheet steel as thick as a newspaper. The wings, stamped metal like a shed roof. No expensive alloys, no complex electronics, no scarce materials. The heart of the machine was the Argus AS-014 pulse jet engine, essentially a tube with a valve grid at the intake. A schoolchild could understand its operating principle. Air enters through the valves, Gasoline is injected, a spark plug provides a spark, the mixture explodes, the valves slam shut from the pressure, the hot gases erupt through the nozzle, creating thrust, pressure drops, springs open the valves, the cycle repeats. 50 times per second, boom, 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 boom. Hence, the characteristic sound, similar to a giant pneumatic drill. The guidance system, a magnetic compass in a wooden sphere to prevent metal interference. 2 gyroscopes from naval torpedoes to maintain course and altitude. And the most ingenious part, a simple propeller on the nose, connected to a counter. Before launch, technicians calculated how many revolutions the propeller would make during the flight to London, given the known wind speed. Once it turned the required number, the control cables were cut, the rudders went to neutral, and the bomb dove down. This entire structure weighed 2.5 tons, raced at a speed of 600 kilometers per hour, and carried a ton of explosives. Its cost? 500 Reichsmarks, like a used car. Assembly time? 280 man-hours, less than a week's work for a small team. For comparison, one Messerschmitt fighter cost as much as 100 V-1s and required a month of work by qualified specialists. On the night of August 17th, 18th, 1943, everything changed. 500 British bombers struck Peenemünde, the secret center for developing German rocket weapons. Operation Hydra claimed the lives of hundreds of German scientists and engineers. Production halls were reduced to rubble. It seemed the Wonder Weapon program was dead. But 2 weeks later, a meeting at the Ministry of Armaments launched one of the darkest chapters of World War II. Reich Minister Albert Speer and SS General Hans Kammler made a decision. Production would move underground, into the giant tunnels in the Kohnstein Mountain near Nordhausen. The new underground factory received the codename Mittelbau, the Central Works. But who would work in these tunnels? German workers were needed at the front. The answer was monstrous in its simplicity: concentration camp prisoners. On August 28, 1943, the first 107 prisoners from Buchenwald arrived at the tunnels. They were to transform a former fuel storage facility into the largest underground factory of death. What followed was described by French prisoner Yves Déon, a survivor of the Mittelbau-Dora hell, as the planet Dora, a place where the ordinary laws of humanity ceased to exist. For the first few months, prisoners lived right in the tunnels, in sleeping galleries, without daylight, without fresh air, without basic hygiene. The only toilets were oil barrels cut in half. The stench was unbearable. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and pneumonia claimed hundreds of lives. 12-hour shifts, rations, watery soup, and 200 grams of bread mixed with sawdust. The temperature in the tunnels never rose above 10 degrees Celsius, even in summer. For the slightest offense, death. For sabotage, which could be declared for an accidental dropped part, public execution by hanging from a crane, right in the assembly hall, so the others would continue working while watching the swaying body. On June 13, 1944, exactly 1 week after the Allied landings in Normandy, a new chapter in the war began. At 4 in the morning, observers from the Royal Observer Corps in Kent spotted a strange object, a small aircraft with a bright flame from its tail, flying at high speed with a characteristic pulsating roar. 7 minutes later, the first V-1 struck the railway bridge on Grove Road in London's Bow district. 6 people died instantly. 200 were left homeless. At first, the British didn't understand what they were facing. Newspapers reported German raiders, but by that evening it became clear this was no ordinary raid. It was the beginning of what would go down in history as the Second Blitz, or the Robot Blitz. The Germans launched V-1s from 96 ski sites, launch ramps resembling ski jumps scattered along the French coast from Calais to Cherbourg. Each site could launch 1 bomb every half hour. At peak times, Over 100 V-1s rained down on London per day. The British reacted swiftly. Operation Diver deployed 3 lines of defense. The first, fighter patrols over the English Channel. The Hawker Tempest proved to be the best hunter of flying bombs. It claimed nearly 500 V-1 kills. Spitfire shot down 227 V-1s. But catching a V-1 in level flight was almost impossible. Pilots would dive from altitude, gaining speed, and had only one chance to attack. Some pilots invented a crazy trick. They would approach a V-1 from the side and carefully slide their fighter's wing under the flying bomb's short wing. The airflow from the fighter's wing would disrupt the V-1's gyroscopes, causing it to tumble down. But this was mortally dangerous. The slightest mistake and the explosion of a ton of explosives would destroy both aircraft. The second line, almost 2,000 anti-aircraft guns along the coast. The third, barrage balloon cables around London, whose steel cables were meant to slice the wings off low-flying bombs. The Germans responded with improvements. When the Allies captured the launch sites in France, launches were moved to the Netherlands. They began using air launches. Modified Heinkel 111 bombers carried V-1s under their wings and launched them over the North Sea, bypassing British air defenses from unexpected directions. While Londoners learned to recognize the characteristic rattling of approaching death, a tragedy of unimaginable scale was unfolding in the tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora. By the end of 1944, the underground factory was producing 600 V-1s per month. Every assembled bomb cost someone's life. French prisoner Jean-Henri Vallard recalled, "We were the living dead, skeletons covered in skin, mechanically performing movements. Many went mad from the constant darkness and roar. They would start screaming and couldn't stop. They were shot right at the conveyor belt." Hungarian Jews arriving from Auschwitz in the summer of 1944 were assigned the hardest work, expanding the tunnels. They chiseled at the rock with primitive tools, without protective gear, inhaling stone dust that turned their lungs to stone. The average life expectancy on this job, 6 weeks. The most terrifying was Hall 41, where warheads were installed. The slightest spark could lead to an explosion. Exhausted prisoners with trembling hands worked with a ton of explosives. Accidents were inevitable. After each explosion, the SS would hold public executions of saboteurs, hanging 10 random prisoners as a warning. In London, meanwhile, the V-1s sowed their own terror. People learned to recognize the stages of approaching death. First, a distant hum like a motorcycle. Then, the growing roar of the pulse jet engine. And the most terrifying part was the sudden silence when the fuel ran out. 12 seconds of fall. 12 seconds to run to a shelter, hide under a table, hold their children close. Nurse Gwen Hewitt recalled, "The worst thing wasn't the explosion, but that silence before it. People would freeze in the streets, heads tilted back, trying to figure out where it would fall. We learned to tell by sound whether it would fly past or not." But sometimes they were wrong. On July 3, 1944, a V-1 hit the American military barracks on Sloane Court. 74 soldiers died, the largest single-loss incident for U.S. forces from a V-1 attack. Witness Bill Fitch described, "I saw a truck with 4 bodies. In the middle of the road lay a head. All along the street, more bodies than one could count." By March 1945, when the last launch site was captured by the advancing Allies, the Germans had launched 9,521 V-1s at England, of which 2,419 reached London. 6,184 civilians were killed. 17,918 were wounded. Another 2,900 V-1s fell on Antwerp after its liberation in an attempt to paralyze the main Allied supply port. But strategically, the V-1 was a failure. It did not break British morale. Londoners who had survived the Blitz of 1940 stoically endured the new blows. It did not stop the Normandy invasion. It did not change the course of the war. Instead, it diverted colossal Allied resources. Operation Crossbow, aimed at destroying V-1 infrastructure, absorbed 40% of all bombing sorties in the summer of 1944. Every bomb dropped on an empty launch site was a bomb not dropped on a German factory or railway junction. Paradoxically, the main legacy of the V-1 was not destruction, but creation, albeit in the perverted form of an arms race. The United States immediately copied the design, creating the JB-2 Loon. The Soviet Union produced its version, the 10KH. Pulse jet technology proved to be a dead end, but the very concept of the cruise missile flourished. Modern Tomahawks, Calibres, Iranian Shaheds, they are all direct descendants of that primitive winged pipe assembled by dying prisoners in the underground tunnels of the Third Reich. Every time we see footage of a cruise missile strike on the news, we're seeing the evolution of an idea born in the hell of Mittelbau-Dora. Out of the 60,000 people who passed through the Dora camp and its subcamps, 20,000 did not live to see liberation. They died from exhaustion, disease, and executions during the evacuation death marches in April 1945. Many bodies remained in the unfinished tunnels. They were simply walled in. Werner von Braun, technical director of the V-2 program, visited Mittelbau-Dora. He saw the living skeletons assembling his rockets. After the war, he became a hero of the American space program, the father of the Saturn V that took people to the moon. Arthur Rudolph, who oversaw production at Dora, became a key figure in developing the engines for Apollo. Only in 1984, under threat of prosecution for war crimes, did he renounce his U.S. citizenship and flee to Germany. In the tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora, 20,000 people perished. From the V-1 attacks themselves, across all countries, about 10,000 died. This story is not about the triumph of technology, but about how a thirst for vengeance turned an engineering achievement into a monument to human cruelty. The V-1 was a weapon of terror, created under conditions of terror. Its buzzing sound terrorized Londoners, but the real horror occurred in the silence of the underground tunnels, where thousands died creating a weapon that was supposed to bring Germany victory, but only hastened its defeat. Today, as drones and cruise missiles once again define the character of war, as kamikaze drones attack cities and their characteristic buzzing once again becomes a harbinger of death, the history of the V-1 gains new relevance. We have learned to make this weapon more accurate, smarter, more lethal. But have we learned to remember the cost, the 20,000 in the tunnels, that the most advanced weapon can be created by the most monstrous methods, and that ultimately any wonder weapon is just a tool? Its monstrosity or humanity is determined by whose hands it is in and at what price it was created. Looking at modern conflicts, where cheap drones decide the fate of battles, it is worth remembering that this story began 80 years ago with a buzzing bomb that killed more of its makers than its enemies.